Eat it, Grandpa. You like to burrow into things. Burrow into this. The words cracked across the small-town diner like a plate dropped on tile. Afternoon light sifted through the blinds in thin, bright bands that fell across a steaming plate of beef stew. Walter Briggs had lifted his fork halfway when Kimberly Dawson stepped close enough for her perfume and beer-sour breath to mingle with the aroma of onions and browned meat. With a deliberate tilt of her chin and a smile that did not reach her eyes, she spat onto the food. The sound was a soft, wet tap against porcelain, followed by the small ring of the spoon as it trembled against the rim. Walter's hand hovered, the tendons along his wrist standing out like lines drawn in graphite. Steam curled upward and broke around his knuckles. A couple at the window stopped mid-bite. The man at the counter turned his head, but stared at the sugar jar instead of the scene. Two women at a corner table pressed their lips together and exchanged quick looks that said they wanted to leave but could not quite move yet. Kimberly's two companions watched her with the expectant glee of people who confuse cruelty for wit, their laughter bright and thin. Walter lowered his fork until it clicked gently against the plate. He did not touch the stew. He did not speak. The faint hum of the milkshake machine filled the space where a protest might have risen. A fly traced a lazy circle near the napkin holder, and the glass salt shaker flashed white under the sun. The world's smallest lighthouse, in a room pretending not to see. Kimberly leaned closer, her voice carrying just enough for the nearest booths to hear. "Now," she said, tapping the edge of the plate with a painted nail. The nail left a tiny crescent in the gravy. Her friends grinned at each other, one of them raising a phone and then thinking better of it, tucking it away as if the act would smear the lens. From the entrance came the gentle jingle of the door chime. Cool air flowed in from the street, folding over the heat of the kitchen and the sourness of spilled beer. A uniformed officer stepped inside and paused, eyes adjusting to the dimmer light. His gaze moved once across the room, unhurried, as the bell stilled, and the blinds sent their narrow shadows sliding across his badge. If you believe every veteran deserves respect, subscribe, because every view helps this message reach those who need it most. That morning had started quietly, the way most mornings did for Walter Briggs. The sun had not yet cleared the ridge east of town when he stepped onto the back porch, a shallow enamel bowl in his hands. The air was cool and damp, the kind of chill that sank into the joints and made them feel their age. He crouched slightly, tipping the bowl over the railing. A scatter of sunflower seeds and millet fell onto the worn boards below, the sound soft as rain. Within moments, the first sparrows appeared, light as drifting leaves, their wings whispering against the air. Walter leaned against the rail, the porch groaning faintly beneath his weight. He watched the birds pick at the seeds, their heads darting, their feet shifting quick and delicate. A cardinal landed among them, bright as a drop of paint against the pale wood. Walter nodded at it, the corners of his mouth turning just enough to register a smile. Back inside, he set the empty bowl in the sink and dried his hands on the towel hanging from the oven handle. On the table sat his old brass wings pin, polished the night before until the light could catch on its edges like fire on water. He lifted it now, weighing it in his palm, then clipped it to the breast of his jacket. It sat there with the easy rightness of something worn for years, a part of him as natural as his own shadow. A knock at the back fence drew his gaze through the kitchen window. Mr. Denning, his neighbor, stood there with a basket under his arm. "Morning, Walter. How's Nora?" Walter stepped out onto the porch, tucking his hands into his pockets. "She's at our daughter's place today, watching the little one." They spoke for a minute about the weather, about the blooms that had come early this year, and then Denning ambled off, his dog trotting beside him. Later, Walter walked into town, his steps slow but measured. The early part of the day was busy. Delivery trucks growled past, and the smell of bread baking drifted from the corner bakery. He paused to let a young man exit before him, but the boy cut across his path, slipping inside without a glance. Walter stepped in after, selecting a small loaf, and paying with coins he counted carefully into the clerk's palm. She sighed, the sound a little too sharp, but he only thanked her and stepped away. Outside, a familiar face appeared, Mrs. Hall from the library, and he paused to greet her. A man behind them muttered something impatient under his breath, skirting around with the exaggerated body language of someone in a hurry. Walter made no comment, merely tipped his head and continued on. By the time he reached the diner, the morning sun had shifted, spilling a warm, angled light through the large front windows. The smell met him first. Frying onions, strong coffee, the faint sweetness of syrup from someone's pancakes. He eased into his usual booth by the wall, the seat cracked and softened from years of use. The waitress brought him his coffee and a bowl of stew not long after. The plate steamed in front of him, the rich scent mingling with the faint tang of fresh bread from the roll beside it. He adjusted his fork in his hand, settling into the comfort of the moment, not knowing that just a few tables away, Kimberly Dawson had already noticed him, her glass of beer half empty, and her words already forming into the insult that would break the room's quiet. Kimberly Dawson had been in the diner for nearly an hour by the time Walter arrived. She sat at a corner booth with two friends from her office, a pair of women who seemed to regard her with the mixture of deference and indulgence one reserves for someone both socially useful and prone to theatrics. 3 empty beer bottles stood in a neat row along the windowsill beside her, each glinting faintly in the shifting sunlight. A 4th was half raised in her hand, the condensation sliding down her fingers onto the tabletop. From her seat, she had an unobstructed view of the door. The moment Walter stepped in, her eyes narrowed just slightly, the smile on her lips changing shape. She leaned toward her companions, speaking in a tone pitched just below the clink of dishes and the low hum of conversation. Their eyes followed her gaze to the man in the worn bomber jacket. One of them arched an eyebrow, the other's mouth curled into the beginning of a smirk. Walter, for his part, saw none of it. He walked to his booth with the slow grace of someone who measured each step, settled himself, and nodded to the waitress when she poured his coffee. Kimberly's grudge was not new, and in her mind, it was well earned. At a town hall meeting weeks earlier, Walter had spoken in favor of ending an outdated municipal service that no longer met its original purpose. The program had continued on out of habit, funded quietly, year after year. Few knew that Kimberly had been one of its lingering beneficiaries, wrongly so, according to the updated criteria. Walter's recommendation, delivered in his calm, measured way, had carried weight in the room. The council had voted to end it, and with that vote, Kimberly's advantage had evaporated. Since then, she had spoken of him often, never kindly. At first, it was in muttered asides in the office or sarcastic comments over lunch. But as others began to defend him, and as more scrutiny fell on her own affairs, revealing whispers of other benefits she had enjoyed without clear entitlement, her bitterness hardened into something closer to contempt. Now, with the faint buzz of alcohol dulling the edge of caution, Kimberly saw an opportunity. The sight of Walter alone, quietly unfolding his napkin, seemed to ignite a petty triumph in her. She leaned back in her seat, the beer glass hovering over the last inch of amber liquid, and said something that made her friends laugh outright. She rose from the booth, smoothed her blouse, and crossed the room in slow, confident strides. Patrons near the center of the diner glanced up at her, some recognizing her as a face from city meetings. She stopped at Walter's table, her shadow falling across his plate. Walter looked up politely, though his eyes held no recognition of malice. Kimberly did not return the courtesy. With a tilt of her chin, she leaned over, and in a single, deliberate motion, she spat onto the steaming surface of his stew. "Eat it, Grandpa. You like to burrow into things, burrow into this." Her voice was sharp enough to carry to the far tables, but not loud enough to make it seem like a performance, more like a private cruelty offered for public consumption. The stew's surface rippled from the impact, steam curling in thin, ghostly lines into the space between them. Walter's fork, halfway lifted, lowered until the tines touched the plate. He neither flinched nor frowned, his expression a careful stillness. At the counter, a man shifted on his stool, muttering, "That's enough." But when Kimberly turned her head toward him, The glare in her eyes was enough to send him back to his coffee. Around them, the air seemed to thicken. Conversations faltered, the clatter of silverware dulled. Kimberly's friends watched from their booth, smiling tightly, their hands wrapped around their glasses. Walter glanced once at the plate, then at the far wall, as though he might find in its faded paint some reason not to rise. He chose silence, setting his fork beside his napkin with the precision of a man who refused to give his temper away. The sound in the diner, the clink of forks, the faint hum of the refrigerator, faded from Walter's awareness. In its place came a deeper hum, a vibration felt more than heard, steady as a heartbeat but heavier, resonating through metal and bone alike. The air around him thickened, no longer warm with the scent of stew and coffee, but hot with the tang of aviation fuel and the dry metallic taste that always came before trouble. He was 25 again, strapped into the pilot seat of a C-123 transport aircraft. Outside the cockpit windows, the afternoon sun glared white off the tarmac of a forward airstrip in Vietnam. Heat shimmered in waves above the ground, warping the line between earth and sky. Beyond the fence, the jungle pressed in, a restless green wall that hid more than it revealed. The call had come less than an hour earlier, an urgent airlift for wounded soldiers trapped in a compromised landing zone. Walter had flown under fire before, but the voice on the radio carried an edge that told him this one was different. He had no illusions about the odds. The strip they'd need to land on was already under sporadic shelling, but there were men there who wouldn't last another hour without evacuation. Engines roared to life under his hands, the vibrations shuddering up through the yoke. The smell of oil and warm hydraulic fluid filled the cockpit, mingling with the faint scent of the canvas straps holding his seat harness in place. Co-pilot Jensen sat to his right, jaw tight, eyes scanning the pre-flight gauges. The approach came low and fast, the jungle rising on either side until it seemed the wings might brush the treetops. Over the intercom, the voice of the lead medic cracked slightly as he called out the first of the wounded. 3 stretchers, 1 critical. Walter brought the plane down on the narrow strip, the wheels bouncing once, then gripping the rough ground. The rear ramp lowered before they had fully stopped. The medics ran, their boots pounding against metal as they loaded the injured. One man's leg was bound in a blood-soaked field dressing. Another stared blankly at the ceiling, lips moving soundlessly in some private prayer. The air inside the hold grew heavy with the smell of sweat, blood, and antiseptic powder from a hastily applied bandage. Then the first shell hit, close enough that the concussion made the side panels shudder. Shouts rose from the loading area. Shrapnel clanged against the fuselage, leaving bright scars in the paint. Walter felt the sting of something slicing across his left forearm, warm wetness blooming under his sleeve, but his hands never left the controls. 2 more! Someone yelled from the ramp. The jungle beyond was alive now with movement, figures darting through the green. Another explosion tore a section of the strip's edge into blackened soil and smoke. Jensen's voice was taut but steady. "We need to go, Walt." The last stretcher came aboard, the medics pulling the ramp closed even as Walter throttled forward. The engines howled, the plane straining against the weight of urgency and gravity alike. The runway fell away behind them, and for a moment it seemed the tree line would rise up to claim them. Then the nose lifted, the trees slid beneath, and they were climbing into open sky. Only then did Walter glance at his arm. The blood had soaked into the fabric, the edges already drying in the hot air. It would scar, like so many other things, but he had learned to fly with scars. The hum of the engine softened, replaced once again by the muted clatter of the diner. Walter's hand rested on the table, the fingers still as stone. The insult Kimberly had thrown at him, the spit in his food, these were nothing compared to the days when every second in the air had been borrowed time. And yet, he felt the familiar weight of restraint pressing against his ribs. Some battles were fought with silence, but that did not make them easy. The bell over the diner door gave a soft, clear jingle, the kind that always seemed to pause the air for a heartbeat. A sliver of cool street air slid in, carrying with it the faint scent of rain that hadn't yet fallen. Heads turned just enough to see the man who entered, tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in the formal dark blue of a full police uniform. The brass badge at his chest caught the slant of sunlight from the windows, sending a single sharp glint across the room. Lieutenant Daniel Harker stood just inside the doorway for a moment, letting his eyes adjust to the warmer light within. His gaze swept the diner in a slow, unhurried arc. The counter with its row of stools, the booths against the wall, the small clusters of locals who'd come for coffee and comfort. And then he saw Walter. There was no hesitation. Harker's stride was measured but certain, the quiet firmness of someone accustomed to moving toward the problem rather than away from it. His boots made a muted thump against the checkerboard linoleum, each step pulling the focus of the room with him. Kimberly noticed him too. Her posture shifted, a quick straighten of the back, a faint recalibration in her smile. She didn't know yet what his presence meant, but her eyes followed him all the same, her friends glancing between her and the approaching officer. Harker reached Walter's booth and stopped. For a breath, he simply looked at the plate, the stew still steaming faintly, the surface disturbed and sullied. Then his gaze moved to Walter, and something in his expression softened. Without asking, he slid into the booth beside him, the leather seat creaking under his weight. He didn't speak right away. He didn't need to. His presence alone was a statement, as plain as the uniform he wore. The room had gone noticeably quieter, the clink of utensils reduced to the occasional hesitant scrape. Kimberly, sensing the attention shifting, tried to regain the room. "Is there a problem, Lieutenant?" Her tone was light, but the undercurrent was brittle. Harker didn't look at her. His eyes stayed on Walter, and when he spoke, his voice was even, deep enough to carry without effort. "Do you know who this man is?" No one answered. Not Kimberly, not her friends, not the others who were watching from their tables. The question hung in the air, heavier with each passing second. Harker leaned back slightly, his arm resting along the back of the booth. Years ago, in Vietnam, Walter Briggs flew into an active combat zone. The landing strip was collapsing under fire. He stayed at the controls until every wounded soldier was on board. He lifted them out just as the tree line closed in. That day, a lot of men made it home because of him. A murmur rippled through the diner. Not loud, but enough to be felt. People were listening now, eyes shifting from Harker to Walter. The weight of the story drew them forward in their seats. Kimberly's mouth tightened. Her friends were suddenly very interested in the condensation on their glasses, their laughter extinguished. Harker's gaze swept the room once, then returned to Walter. Every scar he carries, every steady breath he takes, was earned in service to others. And today, he was shown a disrespect he did not deserve. The words settled like dust in sunlight. Visible, undeniable. Silence followed, the kind that waits for something, or someone, to break it. It was the man at the counter who moved first. He pushed back from his stool slowly, the legs scraping against the floor with a sound that cut cleanly through the stillness. Without looking at anyone else, he stood and placed his right hand in a crisp salute toward Walter. The motion was steady, deliberate, the kind of salute that comes from muscle memory, not ceremony. From a booth near the window, a woman rose. She didn't salute, but she pressed her palm firmly against her chest, her eyes locked on Walter, with an expression that blended gratitude and apology. A pair of older men followed suit, one standing stiffly, the other leaning on his cane, both turning to face the man in the bomber jacket. The movement spread in a quiet ripple. Conversations died completely, silverware stilled mid-air. One by one people rose, some military in bearing, others simply respectful, until half the diner was standing in silent acknowledgement. Even those who remained seated leaned forward, their attention pulled toward the small booth where Walter and Harker sat. Kimberly's smirk, already strained, collapsed entirely. She glanced toward her friends for support, but their eyes avoided hers, their faces pale with discomfort. One reached for her purse. The other shifted her glass away as if trying to erase the shared moment they'd cheered minutes earlier. Neither of them said goodbye before sliding out of the booth and heading for the door, leaving Kimberly alone in her seat. Walter took in the sight slowly. His hand rested on the table beside his coffee cup, the fingers still for a moment before curling around the handle. He lifted it, just slightly. Not a toast exactly, but an acknowledgement, a wordless thank you. The movement was small, but in the quiet of the diner, it felt as significant as a spoken declaration. Harker didn't move, didn't look away from Walter. He gave the barest nod, a gesture of respect between two men who understood that words were sometimes insufficient. The silence stretched, not awkward but reverent. Even the hiss from the griddle behind the counter seemed muted, the air thick with unspoken recognition. Walter lowered his cup, set it gently back on the saucer, and looked around the room. His eyes met those of the man at the counter, the woman at the window, the veterans who stood with hands to brows. In each face he saw something reflected back. Not pity, not discomfort, but the deep, quiet respect that had been absent moments before. Kimberly remained in her booth, shrinking slightly into the corner, as if the space around her had grown smaller. She didn't speak. She didn't move. When Walter finally looked away from her, it was not dismissal. It was a choice to spend his attention on those who had earned it. The spell of the moment lingered long enough that no one rushed to fill it. The recognition had been given, and in its stillness, it carried more weight than any applause could have. The next morning, the story was already moving through town like the slow, steady roll of a drumbeat. It began with those who had been in the diner, their accounts passed in careful detail. The spit in the stew, the taunt, the stillness with which Walter had absorbed it, and the moment Lieutenant Harker had entered to sit beside him. In a town where everyone knew everyone's business, the telling required little embellishment. The facts themselves were enough to stir opinion. By mid-afternoon, the local paper had picked it up, not as a headline, but in the form of a column by one of its senior reporters. The words were measured but firm, describing Walter's service history alongside the events in the diner. Kimberly's name was not mentioned outright, but the description left little doubt among those who had seen her there. At Town Hall, the mayor's office was less cautious. A quiet meeting was called, not for public comment, but for an internal review. Kimberly's position as a sub-secretary in the Department of Education had been unremarkable until now. She was known for her persistence in meetings and her ability to navigate municipal procedures. But the attention from the diner incident brought other questions to the surface. Files were opened. Old authorizations were reviewed. A pattern emerged, slow but undeniable. Kimberly had been receiving benefits and services for which she no longer qualified. Some were remnants of outdated policies. Others were harder to explain without raising the shadow of deliberate manipulation. The whispers of corruption that had once seemed exaggerated now found roots in documented fact. 2 weeks later, an official investigation was announced. Kimberly was placed on administrative leave pending a court hearing. The announcement was read aloud at a council session, the mayor's tone flat, almost reluctant, but resolute in its wording. No one in the chamber missed the subtle shift in the air, the unspoken acknowledgement that the confrontation at the diner had been the spark that lit a much older fuse. The diner itself moved quickly to respond. A letter appeared on the community bulletin board, signed by the owner, expressing sincere apologies to Mr. Walter Briggs for the incident that occurred within our walls. The note went further. Beginning that year, the diner would host an annual Veterans Day breakfast, free for all veterans and active service members. The first event was already being planned, with Walter as the guest of honor. Walter did not seek out the spotlight. He attended his days as he always had, walking into town for errands, feeding the birds in the morning, polishing his brass wings when the light fell just right in the kitchen. But people stopped him more often now. A handshake in the grocery aisle, a nod from across the street, a cup of coffee paid for by a stranger at the counter. It was not the noise of fame, it was the quiet hum of respect, the kind that accumulates like the slow growth of moss on stone. The incident in the diner might have begun as a moment of cruelty, but its echo had settled into something else entirely. A reminder that even in the smallest places, dignity could still be defended. And the truth once given room to breathe, could grow into a force strong enough to change the air of a whole town. The morning of the inaugural Veterans Day breakfast broke clear and cool, the air carrying the faint scent of wood smoke from somewhere up the hill. Walter Briggs dressed with his usual care, the bomber jacket brushed clean, the brass wings pin catching the light as he clipped it to his chest. Outside, the frost still clung to the grass in silver threads, crunching softly beneath his shoes as he walked toward the diner. The windows were already glowing when he arrived, warm with the light of low-hung bulbs. Through the glass, he could see the bustle inside, waitresses weaving between tables, plates of pancakes and bacon steaming in the morning chill, and the easy sprawl of men and women who carried their service in their posture and in their eyes. Some were in faded ball caps embroidered with unit names, others in jackets marked by patches and pins collected over decades. When Walter stepped through the door, the bell's jingle seemed sharper, clearer than usual. Conversations paused, just briefly, as faces turned toward him. Then the greetings came, hands lifted, voices calling his name, a few rising from their chairs to clasp his hand or clap him on the shoulder. He was guided toward a long table at the center of the room, already half filled with veterans of varying ages. An empty seat had been left for him, the place setting marked with a folded card that bore his name in neat, block letters. He settled into the chair, the leather creaking, and let the room's warmth settle around him. The air was thick with the smells of breakfast, maple syrup, frying sausage. The rich bitterness of coffee poured fresh into thick ceramic mugs. The sound of it all blended into a steady rhythm. The scrape of forks against plates, the low murmur of stories passed between friends, the occasional burst of laughter that rose and faded like a wave. Walter listened more than he spoke, nodding at tales of long deployments, dangerous flights, and quiet acts of kindness that had kept men alive in dark places. At moments, he added a few words, a detail here, a knowing look there, and always the others listened, not out of politeness, but because they recognized the weight behind his voice. At one point, a younger veteran, barely in his 30s, lifted his mug and said softly, "To those who stood before us." The gesture was small, but it moved easily around the table, mugs and cups lifting in answer, the sound of porcelain and glass meeting in quiet accord. Walter raised his own mug. The tremor was still there. It always would be. But his hand was steady enough for the gesture to be clear. The light from the windows struck the brass wings at his chest, setting them briefly aglow. As the mugs came down, the conversation resumed, the room returning to its easy rhythm. Outside, the frost had begun to melt, water beating on the glass and running down in slow, silver lines. Walter sat back slightly, letting the warmth of the coffee and the company seep into him. Here, in this room, among these faces, the old bonds still held. Whatever battles remained for each of them, they would not be fought alone. And when his gaze swept the table, the lined faces, the steady eyes, the small, knowing smiles, he lifted his mug one last time, not to speak, but in silent salute. If stories like this resonate with your heart, like and subscribe for more untold moments of honor and kindness. Let us know where you are watching from, and if this moment brought back memories you carry with you. The best way to honor their memory is to keep listening. Click on the suggested video now, and we'll walk together through another untold chapter of courage and sacrifice.